At first, it was almost unnoticeable, just a faint warmth under my cheek, a slight pressure against my skin that I could have brushed off as nothing more than the heaviness of the moment. But as time went on, I started to feel it more. His body pressed gently but unmistakably against mine, the heat between us growing harder to ignore. The warmth from him seeped through the thick denim of his jeans, and I couldn't pretend it wasn't there anymore. It was real, undeniable, radiating through the fabric and sending a jolt of awareness through me. It was well past midnight when my phone buzzed, shattering the quiet of the night. The screen lit up, casting an eerie glow across my bedroom. At first, I thought I'd dreamed it, caught somewhere between sleep and waking. But then it buzzed again, louder this time, snapping me fully awake. I blinked, trying to shake off the grogginess, and squinted at the screen. A strange number flashed, one I didn't recognize. My first thought was to ignore it. Late-night calls from unknown numbers never brought good news. It was probably a wrong number or some telemarketer, something that could wait until morning. But something inside me, some gut feeling, made me answer. "Hello?" I mumbled, my voice rough with sleep. There was a pause, longer than it should have been, before a voice came through, low, hesitant, and urgent. "It's me. Caleb." The words cut through the fog in my head, and I sat up straight, my heart skipping a beat. Caleb. I hadn't expected to hear from him, not at this hour, not like this. My stepson had never called me before, not when his dad was home, not when he was away, not ever. It was strange, and his voice felt out of place in the stillness of my bedroom. "Caleb," I said, his name sounding awkward on my tongue. "What's wrong?" I could hear his breathing on the other end, shaky and tense. "My car broke down," he finally said, his voice cracking. I didn't know who else to call. As soon as the words hit me, I was moving. I threw off the covers, the cool air hitting my skin as adrenaline surged through me. My husband, Travis, was away on business, and the house was quiet, empty. The night outside was heavy with mist, and I glanced out the window, scanning the dark, empty streets. "Where are you?" I asked, my voice sharper now, urgency creeping in. He gave me an address, and my stomach twisted into a knot. It was a part of town I knew too well, and not somewhere I wanted Caleb to be, especially not this late. My pulse quickened as I grabbed my keys, slipped on my sneakers, and headed for the door. "Stay in the car," I told him, already moving. "Lock the doors and don't talk to anyone. I'm on my way." The drive was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the world has shrunk around you. The roads were nearly empty, the usual bustle swallowed up by the rain that had started to fall. The GPS led me deeper into an unfamiliar part of town, down narrow streets that seemed to vanish into the gloom. Flickering streetlights cast long, broken shadows, and old, run-down warehouses loomed on either side, their worn exteriors telling stories of years of neglect. And then I saw it, Caleb's car, parked awkwardly by the side of the road, hazard lights blinking weakly in the rain. I pulled up behind him, my grip tightening on the steering wheel. The sound of the rain against the roof filled the car, and I took a deep breath before stepping out into the cold night. The air bit at my skin as I walked toward his car, my hoodie doing little to keep me warm. Through the fogged-up window, I could see Caleb slumped in the driver's seat, his elbows on his knees, his face half hidden by damp strands of blonde hair. I tapped lightly on the glass, and he flinched, his body stiffening before his eyes met mine. For a split second, I saw something in his gaze, uncertainty, maybe even fear, before he relaxed and unlocked the door. Caleb didn't move right away. He just sat there, his eyes distant, like he was wrestling with something inside. The confidence he usually carried was gone, replaced by something raw and vulnerable. His hair was plastered to his forehead, and his hands fidgeted restlessly, like he was trying to warm them but couldn't. "What happened?" I asked, keeping my voice steady but soft, like I was afraid to break whatever fragile moment hung between us. He let out a frustrated breath, looking away for a moment before his eyes flicked back to mine. "The engine just died," he said, his voice tinged with disbelief. No warning. It just stopped. And my phone was almost dead. I didn't know who else to call. The silence that followed was heavy. It wasn't just the car that had failed him, it was everything else, too. He hadn't called his dad or a friend or anyone else who might have been able to help. He'd called me. The realization settled in my stomach like a weight, heavier than I expected. Come on, I said, trying to sound casual. I'll take you home. He hesitated, glancing back at his car like he was weighing something in his mind. Then, with a reluctant sigh, he climbed out. When he stood, he was closer than I expected, and for a moment, I felt that warmth again, that undeniable pull between us. He was closer than I expected, his presence suddenly filling the space between us, overwhelming in a way I hadn't prepared for. The cold, rain-soaked air seemed to hum with an unspoken tension, something neither of us had acknowledged but both of us could feel. For a long moment, Caleb just stood there, his dark eyes locked on mine, searching my face like he was trying to read me or maybe understand something deeper that he couldn't quite put into words. His expression was hard to decipher, but there was an intensity in his gaze that made my breath catch. I couldn't look away. Finally, he broke the silence with a small, almost imperceptible nod. He shoved his hands into the pockets of his jacket, and the motion seemed to signal the end of whatever unspoken exchange had been hanging in the air. Without a word, he followed me to my car. As I opened the door for him, the rain continued to pour, its steady rhythm like a quiet soundtrack to the stillness between us. Narrator's comment. You ever have one of those moments where you feel like the world's holding its breath? That's what it was like. Like everything around us was waiting for something to happen, but neither of us knew what. Neither of us spoke as we got into the car. The rain tapped against the roof, and the city stretched out ahead of us, quiet but restless. The heater kicked in as we pulled away from the curb, filling the silence with a soft hum. The rain had picked up, streaking against the windshield and blurring the city lights into long smears of color. Caleb sat stiffly in the passenger seat, his head tilted toward the window, watching the empty streets roll by. For the first few minutes, neither of us said a word. The air between us was thick, heavy with everything that wasn't being said. He rubbed his hands together absently, like he was trying to bring some warmth back into them. I turned the heat up a little, sneaking a glance at him. His jaw was tight, his shoulders tense beneath his damp hoodie. You okay? I finally asked, my voice softer than I intended. He didn't answer right away. His fingers flexed against his knee before he exhaled. Yeah. Just, tonight sucked. I nodded, waiting. I knew better than to push. A few more moments passed, the rain tapping against the glass, the road stretching endlessly in front of us. Then he let out a quiet laugh, bitter and almost self-deprecating. You ever have one of those nights where everything just goes to hell at once? He turned his head slightly, just enough for me to catch the flicker of something dark in his expression. I glanced at him, my grip tightening on the wheel. Yeah, I admitted. Plenty of those. He let out a slow breath, shaking his head. I don't know why I called you. That hit somewhere deep, but I kept my voice steady. Because you knew I'd come. He turned to look at me fully this time, and for the first time that night, his walls cracked just a little. His eyes were darker in the dim car, his gaze steady, searching. Yeah, he said after a beat. I did. Something in my chest tightened. I forced my attention back to the road, gripping the wheel a little harder than necessary. The city passed in a blur, the neon lights flickering against the wet pavement. His presence beside me was heavier than it should have been, like he was taking up more space than the passenger seat allowed. You don't have to tell me what happened, I said after a while, my voice careful. He exhaled, leaning his head back against the seat and staring at the ceiling. Some things are just better left alone. That wasn't the whole truth. I could hear it in the way his voice wavered slightly, in the way his fingers drummed against his thigh, like he was trying to shake something off. But I didn't press. Instead, I let the silence settle again, filling the space between us like a quiet storm. The rest of the drive passed in something that wasn't quite uncomfortable but wasn't easy either. Every now and then, I'd feel his gaze on me, like he was about to say something but thought better of it. The air inside the car was warm now, almost too warm, making the dampness of our clothes cling to our skin. When I finally pulled into the driveway, I turned off the engine, but neither of us moved. The rain was heavier now, drumming against the roof, washing the outside world into a muted blur. Caleb sighed, running a hand through his damp hair, making it messier than before. "Thanks for coming," he murmured, his voice quieter now. I nodded, glancing at him. "You can always call, you know. No matter what time it is." He looked at me then, really looked at me. Something in his expression made my stomach clench. There was something raw there, something vulnerable. His gaze dipped just for a second before he blinked and looked away. The air felt too thick, too charged. I cleared my throat, reaching for the door handle. "You should get inside. Get some rest," I said. He hesitated, like he wanted to say something else. Then, with a slow nod, he pushed the door open. The rush of cold air sent a shiver down my spine. He stepped out, then paused, turning back slightly. The rain blurred the edges of him, but his voice cut through the night, steady and low. "I'm glad it was you." I stepped out of the car and followed Caleb up the wet pavement, the rain soaking through my hoodie within seconds. The porch light flickered weakly above us, casting long shadows as I reached into my pocket. My fingers sought the familiar shape of my house keys. They weren't there. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I checked again, other pocket, my bag, even the back pocket of my jeans. Nothing. Caleb, already at the door, glanced back at me. "You good?" I swallowed, my fingers tightening around my empty pocket. "I think I lost my keys." He frowned, his damp hair clinging to his forehead as he turned fully toward me. "You sure?" Panic bubbled under my skin as I patted myself down again, retracing my steps in my mind. I had grabbed them, I was certain. But between leaving the house, rushing to help Caleb, and the drive back, they had somehow vanished. I stepped closer to the door, gripping the handle and giving it a desperate tug, but of course, it was locked. My husband, Travis, had made sure of that before leaving on his trip. I exhaled sharply, my breath coming out in a shudder. "No spare?" Caleb asked. "Not with me," I muttered, my voice tight. The realization hit hard. I had nowhere to go. The only option was to wait until morning when I could either find my keys in the daylight or call someone to let me in. Caleb let out a slow breath, glancing at the storm raging around us. "Come on," he said, tilting his head toward the car. "We'll wait it out inside." I hesitated, my pulse skittering. But what other choice did I have? Wordlessly, I followed him back down the driveway, the cold air pressing against my damp clothes. By the time we slid into the car, my fingers were trembling. Caleb started the engine, letting the heater kick in. A thick silence filled the space, the windshield fogging slightly from our combined breath. I leaned back in my seat, exhaling slowly, trying to push down the frustration and tension that coiled inside me. "You okay?" Caleb's voice was quiet. I let out a breathless laugh, shaking my head. "Not really." He huffed softly. "Yeah. Me neither." Something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten. I turned my head slightly, watching him in the dim glow of the dashboard lights. His profile was sharp, his jaw tense, his hands resting on the wheel like he was holding onto something he couldn't let go of. He looked different in the dim light of the car, more tired, more distant, more vulnerable. His hands rested loosely on his lap, and I shifted in my seat, tucking my knees up slightly, trying to get comfortable. "Guess we're stuck here for a while," I said, breaking the silence. "Could be worse," Caleb murmured, his gaze flicking toward me. There was something unreadable in his expression, something that made the air between us feel heavier than it should have. I forced out a small smile. "Yeah? How?" A ghost of a smirk touched his lips. You could have lost your keys in a worse part of town. At least you're stuck here with me. I rolled my eyes but couldn't stop the warmth that crept up my spine at his words. Lucky me, I muttered, leaning my head back against the seat. The rain continued to fall outside, enclosing us in a cocoon of warmth and silence. The minutes stretched on, and I could feel the exhaustion pulling at me, my body sinking deeper into the seat. Then Caleb shifted beside me. You're shivering, he noted. I hadn't even realized it, but now that he mentioned it, I could feel the damp cold still clinging to my skin, stubborn despite the heat blowing from the vents. Before I could protest, Caleb pulled off his hoodie, leaving him in just a thin t-shirt. He bunched up the fabric in his hands and offered it to me. Here. Take this. I hesitated. You'll be cold. I'll live, he said, his voice firm, leaving no room for argument. Slowly, I reached out, my fingers brushing his as I took the hoodie from him. The warmth of his skin lingered on the fabric, sending an unexpected shiver down my spine. I swallowed hard, gripping the material tighter before pulling it over my head. It was oversized on me, the sleeves hanging past my hands, the scent of him wrapping around me, something faintly musky, something distinctly him. I looked over at him, and for a split second, his gaze dipped just for a moment before he turned away, exhaling softly. The storm outside had settled into a steady rhythm, the rain tapping softly against the roof, the occasional gust of wind rattling the car. Inside, the air had grown warmer, the heater working to chase away the lingering cold. Still, exhaustion weighed heavy on my body, the dampness of my clothes making it harder to get comfortable. I shifted in my seat, trying to find a position that didn't leave my limbs aching. Caleb sat beside me, one leg stretched out, the other bent slightly. His fingers idly tapped against his knee. His hoodie was still draped over me, oversized and warm. Every time I moved, the scent of him curled around me, something deep, familiar, almost grounding. You should sleep, he murmured. I turned my head slightly, meeting his gaze in the dim glow of the dashboard. His voice was softer than usual, less guarded. The edge he always carried had dulled, replaced by something quieter. Easier said than done, I sighed. He let out a quiet breath, tilting his head back against the seat. Yeah. I know. A few more minutes passed in silence. The weight of the night was pressing down on both of us now, the exhaustion creeping in slowly, making my limbs feel heavier, my blinks slower. The warmth of the car, the low hum of the heater, the rain outside, it all blurred together into something lulling, something almost safe. I shifted again, instinctively curling into the fabric of his hoodie. The movement pulled another sigh from me, frustration mixing with fatigue. You never stop fidgeting, do you? Caleb's voice held a hint of amusement. I let out a small, tired laugh. Not when I'm uncomfortable. He was quiet for a moment, then shifted slightly, moving his arm against the console between us. Here, he said, his voice almost hesitant. Might be better if you... He didn't finish the sentence, but I understood. I hesitated for only a second before moving, turning toward him just enough to rest my head against his shoulder. The moment I settled against him, a slow warmth spread through me. His body was warm beneath the thin fabric of his t-shirt, his breathing steady. At first, I kept myself rigid, unsure if this was too much, if I should pull away. But then he exhaled, shifting slightly, his shoulder angling just enough to accommodate me. Something inside me unraveled. I closed my eyes, the exhaustion that had been clawing at me all night finally settling into something softer, something I didn't want to fight anymore. The rise and fall of his breath became something rhythmic, something steady. I could hear his heartbeat, faint but strong, beneath my ear. Are you comfortable now? His voice was quieter, closer. I nodded against him. Yeah. A pause, then softer, good. Good. The car was filled only with the sound of the rain, the occasional creak of the leather seats when either of us shifted. At some point, I felt Caleb's head tilt slightly, just enough that his cheek brushed against the top of my head, not intentional, not accidental either. My breathing slowed. I didn't move away. Neither did he. Somewhere between the storm and the silence, between the weight of the night and the warmth of him, sleep finally found me. The warmth inside the car had settled into something deep, wrapping around us like a cocoon against the storm outside. The low hum of the heater filled the silence, blending with the rhythmic tap of rain against the windshield. Caleb hadn't moved since I'd rested my head against his shoulder, his presence solid and unmoving beside me. But at some point, exhaustion pulled me down completely, and my body shifted, slipping lower without me realizing it. My cheek found a new resting place, not his shoulder, but his lap. The moment I landed there, a slow awareness crept into my hazy mind. The fabric of his jeans was firm beneath me, his thigh warm even through the denim. My breath hitched slightly, though I kept my body still, pretending I hadn't noticed, pretending I was still lost in sleep. But I knew better. And so did he. Caleb had gone completely still. The quiet between us changed, thickening like the air before a storm. He wasn't breathing the same as before, it wasn't obvious, nothing dramatic, but I could feel the subtle shift, the deeper inhales, the way his body seemed locked in place, as if any movement might shatter whatever delicate balance we had found ourselves in. Then I felt it. At first, it was just a whisper of warmth beneath my cheek, a faint pressure I could almost ignore. But as the seconds passed, it became something more, something unmistakable. His body was reacting, right there beneath me, growing harder, the heat from it radiating even through the thick denim of his jeans. A slow pulse of heat coiled low in my stomach. My fingers curled slightly where they rested near my chest. I wasn't supposed to notice. He wasn't supposed to notice. There was no ignoring it now. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. The silence had weight, pressing against my skin, making the space between us feel smaller, the air warmer, heavier. I could feel the tension in his body, the way he held himself so still, like any shift might break whatever restraint was keeping us in check. My breathing shallowed, my pulse thrumming just beneath my skin. I knew I should move, should sit up, should pretend this never happened, but the warmth of him beneath me, the steady rise and fall of his breath, the lingering scent of him still clinging to his hoodie, all of it kept me frozen in place. I didn't know how long we stayed like that. Seconds stretched into minutes, the storm outside continuing its restless song. I could feel the weight of Caleb's gaze somewhere above me, though I refused to look, refused to acknowledge the line we were dangerously close to crossing. Eventually, he let out a slow, shaky breath, his fingers twitching slightly against his thigh. Then, barely above a whisper, he murmured, "You should get some sleep." His voice was different now, lower, rougher, strained in a way I hadn't heard before. I swallowed, forcing my own breath to steady, my mind racing even as I let my body stay relaxed. "Yeah," I whispered back, my eyes still closed. But we both knew neither of us would be sleeping tonight. The car was too warm now, the air thick with something I didn't have the courage to name. My body remained still, my head resting against Caleb's lap, but my mind was racing, hyper-aware of every shift in the space between us. His body was tense beneath me, his breaths measured and careful, as if he was trying not to give too much away. But I could feel it, all of it. The slow, steady heat that had built beneath me hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown, pressing against my cheek in a way that made my stomach tighten. My own breath caught in my throat. I knew I should move. Should pull away. Should end whatever this was before it became something neither of us could pretend to ignore. But I couldn't. The weight of exhaustion mixed with something deeper, something that had been lingering beneath the surface for longer than I was willing to admit. I shifted slightly, just a small movement, barely enough to be noticed, but I felt the way his thigh tensed beneath me, the way his fingers curled against his knee, gripping the fabric of his jeans as though grounding himself. A breath left him, uneven, shaky. I swallowed hard, my own pulse hammering in my ears. The space inside the car felt too small, the world outside lost in the rain and darkness. It was just us, locked inside this moment, inside something we both knew had gone too far but neither of us had the strength to stop. Caleb let out a slow breath above me, one that almost sounded like a quiet curse under his breath. His body was still rigid, his muscles tight, his restraint palpable. For the first time, I wondered what was going through his mind. Was he struggling the same way I was? Was he waiting for me to move, or was he afraid of what would happen if I did? Seconds stretched between us, thick with unspoken tension. I could feel the way his body was reacting, the way he was trying desperately to keep himself in check. And yet, neither of us broke the moment. I knew I had to be the one to move, to create distance before this crossed into something we wouldn't be able to take back. With a slow, careful breath, I pushed myself up, my hands pressing lightly against his thigh for leverage. As soon as I moved, I felt his entire body tense beneath me, a sharp inhale escaping him before he clenched his jaw, his fingers curling into fists against his lap. I hesitated for a fraction of a second, my face just inches from his now, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off his skin. His eyes flickered to mine, dark and unreadable in the dim light of the dashboard. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then his gaze dropped, just briefly, to my lips. My breath hitched. A decision hung between us, fragile and dangerous. But just as quickly as the moment came, it passed. I pulled away completely, shifting back into my seat, hugging my arms around myself as if that could shield me from whatever had just happened. Caleb exhaled a slow and deliberate breath, dragging a hand over his face. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. I turned my gaze to the window, watching the rain streak down the glass, my reflection blurred against it. The air inside the car had changed. It wasn't just warm anymore, it was charged, thick with something we had been pretending to ignore all night. The rain outside blurred the world beyond the windows, enclosing us in something private, something dangerous. I should have looked away, should have let the moment pass. But I didn't. Caleb was watching me, his gaze heavy, unreadable. His breathing had slowed, but there was something restrained in the way his chest rose and fell, something barely held together. My fingers curled against the fabric of his hoodie, my body still humming with the ghost of where I had been just moments before, with the heat of him still lingering on my skin. I didn't know who moved first. Maybe it was him. Maybe it was me. But suddenly, the space between us vanished. His lips brushed mine, just barely, just enough to send a shiver down my spine, to make my breath catch in my throat. He hesitated there, hovering, waiting. His fingers twitched against his thigh, as if he was fighting himself. He was giving me a chance to pull away. I didn't take it. My eyes fluttered shut, and that was all it took. The hesitation snapped. Caleb's mouth collided with mine in a kiss that was nothing short of explosive. The restraint he had been holding on to all night crumbled in an instant. His hand shot up, his fingers threading urgently through my hair as he tilted my head with a possessive pressure, deepening the kiss with an intensity that stole my breath away. Heat rushed through me, enveloping me entirely. The last lingering trace of hesitation evaporated in the wake of his touch. His lips were warm and desperate, parting mine with a hunger that was raw, a hunger that sent a sharp, undeniable ache racing through my chest. I gasped against him, the sound spilling from my lips almost involuntarily. And that sound, my breathless gasp, seemed to shatter something within him. His other hand found my waist, gripping me so tightly that I could feel the faint bruising pressure, pulling me even closer as if he couldn't get close enough. The car, already cramped and stifling, felt even smaller now, the space between us shrinking to nothing. The proximity of his body, the way he pressed against me with a need that was almost painful, erased any sense of distance. His fingers dug into my side, as if he were trying to memorize the feel of my skin beneath his touch, the sensation of me here, now, against him. The kiss, once tender, had turned desperate, wild. Our breaths mingled in a frantic rhythm, the heat of our bodies burning through the layers of clothing separating us. Without even thinking, my body moved of its own accord, leaning into him, responding to the urgency of his touch. My body moved on its own, instinctively shifting closer to him, climbing over the console until I was straddling his lap, my knees pressing into the seat on either side of him. His response was immediate, a low, guttural sound, something deep and unrestrained that rumbled through him and sent a shiver through me. His hands slid to my hips, gripping me tighter, fingers flexing against the curve of my body, pulling me even closer as if he couldn't get enough of the sensation of me against him. His lips parted against mine in a desperate, heated sigh, and just as his hands slid beneath the hem of my hoodie, a sudden noise outside shattered the moment. We both froze. The world outside seemed to stop with us. The rapid rise and fall of our breaths was the only sound filling the car. Our bodies were still tangled together, heat still radiating between us, but the noise, sharp and unexpected, had sliced through the air like a cold splash of water. Caleb's grip on my waist tightened instinctively, his chest rising and falling against mine in quick, uneven breaths. We listened, both of us straining to hear past the relentless patter of rain, which seemed to drown out every other sound. But there was something else, something unfamiliar. A noise, perhaps, or a movement outside. My pulse pounded in my ears, matching the frantic beat of my heart. I turned my head slowly, eyes darting toward the window, still feeling the heat of Caleb's hands on my skin, his touch lingering like a burn. The street outside was empty, bathed in shadows, with only the flickering glow of a streetlight cutting through the rain, casting long, distorted shapes across the wet pavement. But nothing else. Nothing to explain the tension that suddenly threaded through the air. The moment had been broken. Caleb's hands flexed once more, a silent, frustrated movement against my hips, before he let out a sharp exhale, his forehead falling to rest against my shoulder. I could feel the rapid pounding pulse in his neck, his heartbeat matching the frantic rhythm of mine. It was a moment of stillness, a brief silence after the storm of emotions that had just passed between us. My body ached from the intensity of everything, still on edge, still trembling from what had almost happened. The connection between us, whatever it was, hadn't dissipated. It was still there, simmering just beneath the surface, the air between us charged as if the kiss hadn't ended but merely paused, suspended in time. Whatever had just unfolded between us, whatever this was, it wasn't over. It had only just begun. You ever have one of those moments where you know something's changed, but you can't quite put it into words? That's where I was. Somewhere between the storm and the silence, between the heat and the hesitation, I realized this wasn't just a moment. It was the start of something I couldn't take back. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Before we say goodbye, if you haven't yet subscribed, I invite you to hit that subscribe button. Your support, even if it feels like a small gesture, means the world to us and keeps us creating stories that matter. Don't forget to give this a like if you enjoyed what we shared today. Every interaction helps us grow and connect with you through the stories we tell. Thank you for being part of this community.